The Standard Deviations podcast is a weekly production that looks at money, mind, and meaning, all through a psychological lens. Each week, psychologist and New York Times bestselling author Dr. Daniel Crosby interviews a fascinating new guest, experts in everything from finance to literature to wellness.
When was the last time you splurged on something when you knew it probably conflicted with one of your financial goals, like paying down debt or saving for future fun in retirement? Well, if you do this, you're not alone. It's because of present bias, or to use the psychobabble term, hyperbolic discounting. As humans, we have a tendency to let the immediate rewards of the here and now win out over a desired future reality. To learn more, check out the Cash Dash Dash, a planning tool brought to you by the Guardian Network to see just how much your short-term spends might be impacting your longer-term financial goals. Play today by visiting www.livingconfidently.com/play. Hello and welcome to the Standard Deviations podcast. I am your host, Dr. Daniel Crosby, and I am joined today by Ashvin Chheda. Ashvin will be joining me today in what is the first of a two-part series on immigration and finance. So Ashvin, thank you for joining us today.
Thank you.
Can you tell us just a little bit, to start out, can you tell us just a little bit about your work life? What do you do? Where do you live?
Yes, so I'm a financial planner. My firm is Opus One Advisors. I am based out of Dallas, Texas, but I live in a suburb in the north of Dallas called Frisco, Texas. And I've been here pretty much since I moved down after graduate school. I've been here for about 25 years. My kids were born here. Texas is pretty much my home. I've spent more than half my life here now. So that's where I am.
Beautiful place. So we're going to talk about immigration and finance today, but I wanted to, before we sort of pick your brain and get your perspective professionally, I wanted to hear a bit more about your personal story. So would you mind sharing a bit about your own immigration story with the listeners?
No, absolutely. I'd be very happy to share that. My father actually came to the U.S. From India for his PhD in the mid-50s. He went to actually Oklahoma A&M, which is now OSU, and he was an agronomist. He went back to India, met my mother, who was wrapping up her dental degree over there. They got married, and my father had always been interested in academia, so he went, found a great position in Nigeria, West Africa, and he was a college professor at the University of Ibadan in Nigeria, West Africa. My mother was a clinical lecturer in the dental school. They spent 40 years there. So my two older sisters were conceived there and raised there. And I was born and raised in Nigeria, West Africa. Did my elementary school and secondary school there. They call it primary and secondary there. There's no concept of elementary, middle, and high. So it's just primary and secondary. By the time I was ready for university, the political situation was becoming very unstable. My parents had decided they didn't want to leave Nigeria. They already spent more than half their lives there, and they wanted to see out their retirement there. But for me, it made sense to go abroad and study. So I ended up going to Manchester, England, to do my undergraduate degree, which was in electrical engineering. And then from there, the opportunities were always going to be in the U.S. And so I came to the United States, went to University of Michigan for graduate school. And, from there, I got hired by a Canadian telecom company, a research company called BNR, Bell Northern Research. And interestingly enough, though they were Canadian, they moved me down to their lab in Richardson, Texas at the end of 1995, where I've been ever since. So that's sort of my journey. So I've sort of, been through multiple continents, lived on multiple continents. But again, I've spent more than half my life now in Texas.
So this is just your everyday story of a young Indian man growing up in West Africa, studying in England, working for a Canadian company in America, right?
Correct. Yes.
Okay.
Yeah. Yes.
Okay.
Yes.
Perfect.
Yeah.
So you've got this sort of rich tapestry of cultural influences, and so by the time you move to the States, and Texas is its own sort of cultural tapestry, Texas has
Yes.
its own sort of rich singular culture. What was the most sort of surprising thing about moving to the States? What cultural tendencies caught you the most off guard?
So it's interesting, I guess, because I grew up mostly with West Africans. I mean, most of my friends were Africans, my closest friends. So the biggest culture shock was actually going to the United Kingdom. Because I went from essentially where 99% of my close friends were Africans, and and then I went to university in England, where all of a sudden 90% of my friends were Caucasian. So it was actually a very big culture shock for me, which probably set me up well for coming to the United States. And when I came over to Michigan, University of Michigan is a very strong university. They have, especially in their graduate programs, they have students from all over the world. So in a sense, the adjustment was quite easy. Similarly, moving down to Texas, I moved down, to basically a big city, Dallas. Dallas is a major city in the U.S., and so it's very, very culturally diverse. And so I didn't have perhaps a shock that I might have if I moved to maybe a small town, if I would stereotype without offending anybody. If I had moved to maybe a small town in the middle of Texas, it might have been different. But moving to Dallas, not so much the case. And especially also working for an engineering company, as you know, a lot of engineers are from all over the world. So I probably had more diversity leaving Nigeria than I did in Nigeria, if that made sense. So the adjustments were easy for me once I left England. The adjustments were quite easy.
And then quickly, how did you find your way from engineering to the world of finance? So that's not an uncommon transition. I actually see that quite a bit, but I'm interested in your story.
So my story is interesting. My father had retired from the university in Nigeria, moved back to India, repatriated back to India with my mother in '97, and then was coming back and forth between India and the US. And I have an older sister in England who's a dentist, so he would kind of make a pit stop there. And in 2001, when he was here, he started to complain that he wasn't feeling well. All of a sudden, my father actually up until that point was very, very healthy, never really had any issues. It was my mother who actually had more medical issues. And so we were a little concerned. I have another older sister here who's a physician. She had him checked out, and they found out that, he had cancer, and he had liver cancer. And so again, this is really not about medicine, but what's interesting is a lot of people in India, especially of my father's generation, they sometimes have what they call vertical transmission of hepatitis. They get it from like their mother's breast milk. And apparently my father was a carrier for his whole life and never knew it. And one day just manifested in a form of liver cancer, which, at that point, once your liver starts failing, you wouldn't know. And then it's a very rapid downhill. So my father at that point wanted to sit down with me. Again, typical Indian family. I'm the only son. He's like, look, I need you to look through my finances with me. Not that I expect you to do anything, but I'd like you to just kind of see where things are in case your mother needs, help. At least you know where things are. So when I sat down with my father, I was pleasantly surprised. I mean, all his, his finances were very nicely buttoned up. He had his investment accounts in the UK, he had bank accounts in India, he had his wills and trusts. I mean, property deeds, everything was very nicely done, meticulously. I think my father was always, a very thorough and meticulous person. And, shortly after that, my father passed away, and I realized, just in sitting down with my father, that I hadn't done any of my own financial planning. The only thing I had done up until that point was, putting money in a 401k and paying my mortgage. And that was pretty much the extent of my planning. I wasn't thinking about anything beyond that. So my father's sort of, book was very eye-opening to me. And I realized that I probably needed to get some things done. And so I, reached out to my sister, and I asked her who she was using, and she recommended her advisor to me. I started working with the gentleman, and needless to say, I realized in going through that process with him that there were a few things I took care of with him, but it wasn't complete, and there was gaps, perhaps in his knowledge base or gaps in his approach. And being a researcher and engineer, I need to have something that's very process driven in my mind. Otherwise, there's a disconnect. And so I started to do a lot of my own research and learning, and one thing led to another. I ended up getting my stockbroker's license, ended up getting my insurance license, enrolled in the American College to get, my designations, and started working with friends and family, mostly as a glorified hobby. And then the hobby resulted in a eureka moment one day. And I said, hey, you know what? This is actually not a hobby. This is actually a practice. And it's building. I'm getting referred to people all over the country, and my passions are no longer aligned with engineering. So it would be as good a time as any to retire as an engineer and do something that I'm really passionate about. And the rest, as they say, is history. So that's how the transition occurred. So it was accidental. It wasn't planned.
I find so many people, finance is such a great second career. And I think especially for people with an engineering background who already have this sort of systematic analytical mindset, I think they're uniquely well equipped to do this well. So you've set the table now for this sort of unique career transition that happened very organically as you tried to set your father's affairs in order. You've set the table for why you might be the most interesting man in the world, having sort of had your hand in many different cultures. And so we're going to talk today about how some of that experience informs the way that you and the way that other financial planners should work with immigrant populations. But before we go to that in earnest, it would be strange if we didn't talk for a minute about the impact of COVID-19, because when we set up this interview, it wasn't that long ago. But the world seems to have pretty fundamentally changed in that time. And at first, when COVID was beginning to sweep across the country, I think I read a lot of articles about how coronavirus is the great equalizer, because, no matter your race, religion, occupation, this is sort of the great equalizer. But I think subsequent research has shown that immigrant populations, that people of color, that people who are lower on the socioeconomic spectrum are more impacted than this. Certainly people in sort of frontline occupations. So what are you seeing with respect to the people that you work with, to the degree to which they have been impacted by the spread of coronavirus?
Yeah, so it's a great question. So majority of my client base are actually first generation immigrants to the United States. I would say 80% of them. Majority of them are, white collar professionals, doctors, dentists. But there's a fair number of them that are business owners. They own IT companies and things like that. So what's interesting right now, if I would kind of split the client base that I have. I'm seeing certain white collar professionals like dentists and optometrists. They're actually having major financial implications all of a sudden because, a lot of dentists, they don't really do emergency dental work. I mean, they do, but it's mostly elective. You go in for cleaning, a cavity, so on and so forth. Optometrists, it's the same thing. And, with the shelter at home in so many states, my dentists and optometrist clients are actually really starting to feel the financial pinch of not having revenue. So again, we've certainly counseled them about taking advantage of a lot of the programs that have been put in place, like the PPP program and the disaster relief loans and things like that. But they're feeling the financial pressure immensely. Now, again, a lot of my clients, at least who have been listening to me over the past, they do have cash reserves. I mean, they've done, a lot of them have done or taken the the feedback and the advice that we've given them to always have cash reserves on hand and things like that. But in any case, when you don't know if your practice will come back, when you don't know, if you'll have the same kind of revenue stream, it creates its own set of anxieties, right? Which then can manifest itself in how you look at your investment portfolios. Now all of a sudden they're starting to look at some of the investment portfolios a little differently, even the longer term portfolios, and I'm having to help them work through the behaviors around that. Obviously, there's a certain element of fear from a financial perspective, and even when they start going back to work, how are they going to adequately protect themselves from a medical perspective? So that's one segment where they are really, seeing the implications of that. I have a lot of clients who are doctors. Again, I have ER doctors, I have neonatologists. So I have some that are going to work as usual. There's no implicit financial implications to them, other than a lot of them are, when you have conversations with them, they are, obviously genuinely scared. They're in the front line. I mean, they have all the protective stuff, but as some of my ER doctors have told me, I mean, you could be very healthy and it could take your life. And so there's an immense fear factor there that, once they, some of them don't articulate that to me, maybe we're not as close, and some really just tell me, we're frankly scared. A lot of my clients are IT professionals. I mean, they work as engineers and software designers and architects. A lot of them are working from home. The technology world is used to that. I mean, a lot of them used to work from home before anyways, at least part of the time. So they're probably the best group that have adjusted to this in terms of work. They're not seeing any major financial implications to their paychecks yet, except for obviously their 401ks and some of their investment accounts taking a hit. But from a work perspective, they're handling that fairly well. I mean, obviously, if this goes longer, eventually their industry would get hit, and so we're talking through some of those things. But most of them are sheltering at home. They're using the Amazon Primes, the Instacarts. I think mostly being responsible and trying to make sure they are not contributing to the spread. So they're probably, as a group, are handling this better. I have some small business owner clients, they own, Taco Bells, they own Subways, they own hotels, motels. They're really struggling right now, and they're frankly quite scared because they don't know, especially some of my clients who own motels and hotels, they don't know how it's going to come back and, in what shape, way, or form. And that's also a challenge for me because, it's something that, you can study about it in textbooks and you can deal with, corrections like 2008 or 2001, but this is medical. So, there's no real blueprint. The world has changed a lot since the Spanish flu of 1918. And so, it's also a challenge for me in counseling a lot of clients around that. A lot of my clients are concerned about their families back home. They have families in India. India has shut down, Dr. Crosby, for a long time. I mean, in fact, I believe last week they extended their shutdown another 2 weeks. And so that's also a concern. I know we are sending money back to my father-in-law and my wife's family because they're not perhaps as well to do. And, my brother-in-law is not getting paid. He works as a hardware computer repair person. So he doesn't have work. He's not getting paid. And so, we're sending money back home, obviously, to kind of help them. But, and then places are smaller in India. And so when they're there, it's very hard for them to move around. So there are a whole set of challenges there as well. A lot of my clients are dealing with that, with their extended families back home. So yeah, it's certainly makes for very challenging and interesting times. I've had a few clients actually come down with COVID. Thank God and thankfully, none of them have been admitted to hospitals. They're all in various stages of recovery at home. So at least, at least the people that I know that have been, affected by this themselves with the actual virus, again, thank God they're recovering well at home. And so that is kind of where we are.
No, thank you. If you don't mind, there's a couple of follow-up questions I'd like to ask because you gave some really fascinating context there. I'd like to focus on your the dentists, the optometrists, and the small business owners. So the ones that are perhaps the most impacted by this, and the ones that are dealing with the most uncertainty. So just from the behavioral lens, from my seat as a psychologist, first of all, we know that the only thing people hate more than bad news is uncertain news. This is a conversation my wife and I have had many times throughout this coronavirus crisis. We say, God, if we knew what to prepare for, it would be one thing. Even if it was tough, if you knew how long it would last and what it would require of you, it'd be one thing. But not knowing what the market will do, not knowing if what the food situation will look like, not knowing what the school situation will look like, it's very unsettling. And there's a sort of this low hum of anxiety. So you also mentioned, I think very astutely, that it changes the way that they look at their portfolio. So we also know that emotion, whether or not you're in a good mood or a bad mood, impacts the way you view identical financial information. So I just wanted to drill down a bit and hear how are you counseling these clients? Are you taking more of a sort of a friend first hand holding approach? Are you trying to show them market statistics that show that, dips in the market have historically been good buying opportunities? How are you approaching these people that are dealing with this sort of unprecedented level of insecurity?
Yeah, so I think my style and my mindset and my passions around my industry are always related to being a very relationship oriented individual, but I'm still a scientist at heart. So a lot of the times my focus with my clients initially is really just empathically listening and really trying to understand what they're dealing with, and really for me to step in their shoes and imagine that I was in the same situation, right? First and foremost, again, thankfully, I'm going to take a revenue hit with my business, but I follow my own advice, and my business is fairly stable for the most part. So I think from that perspective, I don't have those anxieties, but I try to put myself in their positions first and foremost to really let them know that I am listening to them, I am understanding where they're coming from. And for a long time I always educate my clients to think about their money in terms of buckets, right? I'm a big proponent of this bucketing concept, right? So rather than having one portfolio that's a 70-30 or a 60-40 or an 80-20, which we know scientifically and theoretically will still work, I like to educate my clients to think in terms of buckets of time. And so maybe it's a little different approach, but I tell my clients, or in the next, if we're thinking about your planning, let's bucketize out your money. So for example, 0 to 3 or 0 to 4 years of expenses, I always want somewhere where you have access to it, and it might be invested, but it's going to be somewhat conservative, right? Maybe years 4 or 5 on out, might be a little bit more aggressive, and buckets that are really, we're not going to touch 10 plus years out, we can perhaps be more aggressive. But understanding again the differences between risk capacity, risk tolerance, all of those things. So I've always educated my clients about bucketizing their money. And again, the clients that have listened to me, I have a conversation with them. I say, look, you've been sitting on this 3 to 4 year bucket of money that's mostly in conservative instruments. I mean, if at all you've taken a hit, it's been very small. The buckets that are further out, yes, it's painful to see it, but let's go through and understand how history can teach us. What happened in 2008, what happened in 2001, what happened in 1987. And again, just because, things have recovered in a particular way, we understand they may not recover the same way, or they might, but history generally is a great teacher. And so I try to kind of keep my clients focused on, the concerns they have now, and not have it translate to something that could probably impact them later because they made a drastic move. So I find when I use a bucketing technique, I'm able to manage their behavior better. Now, of course, the clients who haven't listened to me, unfortunately, we're in a little bit of a different situation, and we just have to deal with that, right?
Sure. So, Ashvin, you may not have known this, but you're doing a lot of really behaviorally complex counseling and planning there because,
Absolutely.
this whole idea of bucketing is based on the behavioral principle of mental accounting, which is that people spend money and save money and invest money differently depending on how it's labeled. So I wrote an entire book on bucketing. I'm a huge advocate of bucketing. And I think people who have had a safety bucket that they expected to spin down in a time of market turmoil are much better positioned than those who didn't. And I love this sort of blended approach of, you said you're both an empathic person and a scientist. And at my firm, we have a 3-part process for counseling clients through a difficult situation. And we call it purpose, proof, and process. So the purpose is the empathy. It's recentering that person on what matters to them, why they came in the first place, recentering them on the plan. The proof is really the science, sharing with them a little bit of market history, giving them some guardrails for what a recovery might look like in terms of size and scope and timing. And then process is getting them engaged in sort of moving forward, making good decisions. So you're doing a lot of really fantastic stuff from a behavioral perspective. Yeah, absolutely. So, you mentioned something else. You mentioned sending money home. So I lived in Southeast Asia for a couple of years. I was a professor at a school in Hawaii for a time that had a very diverse population, largely Pacific Islanders, and many of the students and the employees at that school would send money home to their parents. Now, to the Caucasian American mind, this is an entirely foreign concept, right? We're very, as a collective, very individualistic, very like, I'll get mine, you get yours. So if someone is coming from a place of financial abundance, certainly sending money home is no problem, and that's a kind and a generous thing to do, and that's no problem. Do you ever run into clients who are sending money to others, though, for cultural reasons that haven't sort of put their own oxygen mask on, who haven't secured their own financial house? And if so, how do you counsel them in a way that's respectful of that cultural imperative, but also maximizes the probability that they'll reach their own financial goals?
It's a great question, Dr. Crosby. So, it's interesting. I have a lot of my clients where they don't even realize that what they're doing is inefficient, right? In their minds, they're stable, and so they're very happy to send money back home. But in their minds, they're stable. As a professional, I know they're not, right? And then there's some that are clearly unstable, but they're still doing it. So let me segment the two, right? So I'll have a lot of clients who are doing well. They're good middle class, upper middle class. They're making good money. And so they're sending money, every month back home. And so they feel that, everything is good. They're investing for their own retirement. They're doing all of the right things, and then sending money back home. But what I think they're failing to see, and where I really try to help educate them, is I really try to make them understand that the source of all of this capital is them, is their ability to work, is their ability to generate a paycheck. And so if something were to affect that, if something was to, perhaps they get disabled tomorrow, perhaps they're driving and they hit a pedestrian and they get sued, God forbid they die, right? What happens to not just their immediate family's dreams and aspirations, meaning their kids' college, their spouse's retirement? Now what happens to their aged parents back home that they're supporting, or maybe their siblings, in India that are not doing as well, right? Like we support, again, I mentioned we support, my family back home on my wife's side. So, I have to realize, and I have to get my clients to realize, that all of that is really our income source more than anything else, and that has to be protected first and fully. Then we can move on into, our own financial stability of, making sure our kids' colleges are taken care of and retirement is taken care of, because otherwise, are we expecting somebody to help us later? I always kind of joke around with my clients and say, listen, you're first generation immigrants over here. You come with this cultural mindset that you bring, and you take care of your parents and relatives back home, and that's a really noble thing. But I want you to realize one thing, and I'm in the same boat. I have 3 sons. They're growing up in America. They're Americans. And yes, while they may pick up on a lot of our culture and value systems, they still go to school here. They're still used to the American way of life, and they're Americans. And so they're going to grow up with slightly different mindsets. And they might not have the same, they might not have the same mindset that you do. And so if you don't take care of your own retirement, as an example, you might have a real problem. So I have to kind of tell people who don't realize that they are not as secure or stable as they are, how they should think about it. And again, I start with this idea of make sure you protect your income, and then make sure you fund your buckets, and then you can, of course, start helping, family back in India. And then there are some people that just clearly know they're not in a good place, and they really want to, help family back in India because maybe they're in a worse place. And so now it's more a question of just, budgeting and making sure that, we're saving as best as we can. We're doing the things we have to, but I have to be respectful of that and just help them, try to budget through, how to fund that. Now, the good news is obviously a dollar goes a long way in rupees. So, that's the good news, right? So when you send, $200 home a month, it'll go a long way. I mean, it'll get, depending on which part of India you live in, and so on and so forth. So at least that's in their favor.
Sure. Well, there's a couple of things I really like about how you position that. The first thing I think you did is you make the implicit explicit, because it's this whole notion. We all grow up in these cultures. We grow up in these cultures, but in the same way that a fish doesn't know it's wet, we're always not aware of our cultural assumptions until we encounter a culture with countervailing cultural assumptions. And so you have to say, like, look, you're making the implicit explicit to these first generation folks you work with, and saying, look, you're in a different, you're swimming in a different pond now, and your kids may not have the same expectations that you grew up with. So you're really sort of highlighting those. And then the second thing that I like is that you're giving advice that is A, sound advice, but B, is couched in terms that are respectful of their cultural imperative. Like, I want you to send money home, and the best way that you can ensure that you're able to spend money home is by securing your own income and not making it, contingent on things that are a little more uncertain. So I think that's a good, whether we're working within or outside of our own cultural disciplines, I think that's a great sort of framework to keep in mind, to be respectful of those cultural imperatives, but to give sound counsel inside of that. So
Yeah.
Oh, go ahead.
No, and I was going to tell you, so, the other thing I wanted to mention to you is, what's also interesting is I also remind my clients that there are certain things they do here that their parents in India never had to do. Like, one of the big things as we plan with our clients, again, with immigrant families, they're big proponents of higher education. A lot of them came here for their graduate school, or, a lot of them came here, and from the graduate school, it took them to the next, it's allowing them to live the American dream. And so, they want that for their children, obviously. And we know how expensive college is, right, in the US, and it tends to inflate higher than regular inflation. And so a lot of our work is around counseling our clients to think about college planning, because it's so important, right? It's actually challenges back home that, they never had to think about, right? I mean, college in India is very manageable in terms of price relative to what people make. And so I remind them of things like that you're almost a sandwich generation now. You're thinking about taking care of your parents or relatives, and you also have to worry about your children. And it's something that, in a way, your parents didn't have to worry about, because the cost of education, in India and a lot of other places is much more reasonable, right? And so I kind of just have them start thinking about that a little bit, so we can temper things and maybe just really get them to understand, they are in a little bit of a unique and different situation than their families in India were.
So you've done a great job of anticipating my question, which was just to sort of highlight how in general, right, the financial concerns of a first generation American family may differ from that of, say, a fourth or fifth generation American family. So you've highlighted the potential need to send money back home. You've highlighted some cultures, the importance of education in some cultures as sort of a signpost of having made it and how expensive college can be. What other considerations are there that might differ with first generation folks?
So what's interesting with a lot of my first generation clients is, especially depending on how long they've been here, it's kind of funny. I always make this expression: you're living with one leg in a suitcase, right? So, a lot of times when I'm working with clients, they have this mindset that they will not retire here. They will go back to India, which is interesting because I give them my experience in doing this now for 16 years, where I say, especially my more recent clients, I say, that's great. We're going to account for it and think through it, because obviously if you go back to India to retire, you need property there, you need all of these things. There's a different set of challenges. Your children will live here, so you'll go back and forth kind of like my parents did. But also tell them these things will change, because what's going to happen is, I've had clients for 16 years where that was their mindset. And now their kids getting older with, just time spacing things out, it's changed. So we have to be able to pivot, because that might happen. But if it doesn't, you're probably going to have to set up two homes because your children are going to be here. So even if you quote unquote retire and you decide you want to live 6 months offshore, there's two households now that you have to think about. So it's interesting where it becomes another part of our planning process to kind of think through that. Also, a lot of my clients, are on H-1Bs, and I don't know if you know, Dr. Crosby, a lot about the way immigration works here, but a lot of my clients are on H-1Bs. And if you are unfortunately, or rather, if you have the unfortunate luck to be born in India, because the H-1B actually goes by the country of birth. So I was born in Nigeria. So even though I'm of Indian origin, it didn't count as much. But if you're born in India, the queues are ridiculous. You'll have people that will be on H-1s for 10 to 15 years before they get their green card. Because you would think the queue is first in, first out across the world. It isn't. It's based on your country of birth. And obviously India, a lot of Indians come here for higher education. So the queues are very long. So there's a great deal of anxiety that they have about their immigration status. In fact, one thing I should have mentioned to you earlier when you asked about COVID, but it didn't dawn on me until now, is I'm dealing with a whole segment of my client base that are extremely concerned about their immigration status because they're on H-1s. H-1s get renewed every so often. And if they don't get renewed, they only have a certain number of days that they can legally stay in this country. And so they're always dealing with that level of anxiety that, if our H-1 doesn't get renewed, what happens, which holds them back from making perhaps certain decisions that are really going to be in their best interests if they didn't have to worry about that. And that's another, challenge that I have to deal with in my planning is my clients that are on H-1B visas.
So this is a question that's just come up for me, right? You've explained so many things to me that are indeed sort of outside of my area of expertise. So if someone has a client, if a financial professional has a client who is from outside of their own culture, and they may have some culture specific or immigration specific needs, how would you best advise that financial professional to go about getting up to speed to serve the very particular needs of that client?
So I think, well, one is obviously cultural, right? Just understanding what their value system is and what's important to them, right? The other thing is if there's a young financial advisor or an experienced financial advisor that's getting into this market of working with more immigrants who are on those kind of visas, it's extremely important to perhaps get some time with an immigration attorney just to understand all the nuances that go into, what it takes, right? Now, again, if you're working with immigrants from most other parts of the world, the queues are very fast. I think my understanding is it's India, China, and I believe Mexico, but I could be wrong on that one. But definitely India and China that have very, very long H-1B queues that are incredibly long. And so most other countries, they're fast. Like if you were born in Nepal, you had your H-1B, you'd probably get your green card within a couple of years. Again, not counting today's situation because I think everything's slowed down. But places, if you're working with Indians, you better understand from an immigration attorney all the steps that these guys go through, and then you'll understand, and then put yourself in their shoes. You're working here, you're living here, your children are growing up here. Now, if you're lucky and your children are born here, at least that's a good thing because they're citizens. But I have clients that have been on H1, Dr. Crosby, for 12, 13 years. Their children weren't born here, but they're Americans. So what happens if these clients are forced to go back to India because their H-1B doesn't get renewed, or they get laid off and they can't find a job within 90 days? I think about, they've lived now here so long, think about the implications that they're going to go through, and then more importantly, their children. So those are things that if you work with immigrants from India, especially technologists, you really have to understand that and understand what they're going through. Otherwise, you won't be able to solve problems for them in a way that's going to work. Because if you take the traditional approach and you start doing, life insurance, you start doing the disability insurance, you do the investments, you do all of these things, and all of a sudden they get laid off, they can't find a job, and they have to go back to India, it will mess up the planning. I mean, first and foremost, your disability is not going to work, because if they get disabled, most disability contracts don't pay if you're living anywhere but US and Canada. So if an immigrant gets disabled and he can't work and he has to go back to India, the disability is going to stop after a year. None of these carriers are going to pay it because they don't know if there's fraud occurring or not. It's very hard for them to tell. So there are those kind of challenges you have to develop in your practice, which again comes with experience as you keep working with them.
Yeah, no, just from our brief conversation, I can tell that, taking a cookie cutter approach to this would land you in a world of trouble potentially, just because the needs of first generation immigrants are so specific and there's so much to consider. There's a lot of ramping up you would have to do to get the sort of requisite expertise for sure. Yes. So one of the things that I found, sort of my last question before we get to the lightning round, in a former life, I was a counselor. And again, I spent some time in Hawaii in a school setting where there were students from, 75 different countries. It was just really, really diverse. It was really fascinating melting pot of cultures. And I found when I was doing my counseling that many of the interventions that had worked well with longtime residents of the US did not work well with international students. So for instance, if you're having family problems, Caucasian Americans are very happy to talk about their families, even if it casts people in a negative light. But I would work with some populations of Asian students, and they were very, very uncomfortable saying negative things about their family members, even if those family members had done some pretty tough things to them. So are there any other sort of culturally informed financial tips that you could share, just things to keep in mind when dealing with immigrant populations that people like me, who may be trying to fit a square peg in a round hole, can do to just be more culturally informed or more culturally sensitive?
Yeah, so I think, as one of the things, as a good financial advisor is, I tend to spend a lot of time with my clients really understanding them and really trying to build a very strong relationship with them, which is, at the end of the day, money is about trust. So the stronger the relationship, the more personal relationship you can have with your clients, of course, within a professional setting and within the time that you have, becomes more important, right? So I usually take a more counseling type approach with my clients, especially in the first couple of meetings, which is more discovery based, to really try to get them to open up. And I do that more by asking very open-ended questions, as opposed to sitting there and lecturing them on, well, I think you should do this, I think you should do that. I mean, that might come later, but very early in my practice is very much about open-ended questions, right? Obviously I ask them, how they got to where they are, what kind of sacrifices they had to make, what their families had to do. Are they happy where they are? Do they see growth for themselves? How do they anticipate growing? What do they want for themselves and their children? And then what perhaps is holding them back, as they think about extended family. How do they think about, their connections with extended family, especially if it's 3,000 miles away? So I ask them a lot of that. I also, again, as a financial planner, I do ask them, we're going to talk about your wills, your trusts. It's important to understand who you would pick as guardians and who you would not pick. So it's important to understand, which of those family members you think would be better guardians for your children if you guys were not there. Which of your family members might be appropriate trustees for a trust, which ones might not be. And so I ask those kind of questions where it's almost like they have to give me the answers, otherwise I can't plan for them, right? And so then slowly they open up and I start to see, the dynamic between them and their extended family and other things that might be holding them back or might not be holding them back. So it's really about just, lots and lots of discovery type questions and sort of leading them slowly as opposed to just telling them what they need to do.
So the reason I think there's two reasons I think a detailed discovery process is such a good idea. The first is just the nuts and bolts of, if you're working with a complicated case, many of the issues you brought up today, wouldn't emerge if you were taking a sort of cookie cutter approach to working with your clientele. They would only be unearthed in a detailed discovery process. So there's sort of a practical reason. But I think there's also a relational reason, right? The discovery process is where the two of you get on the same page. You're able to exhibit empathy and care and interest. And I think all of those things lay the foundation for a really solid relationship going forward. So I'm absolutely on the same page with you there. So Ashvin, in closing, we like to do a little segment where I do a free association. I throw out a word or a phrase, and you just tell me the first thing that comes to your mind.
Oh boy.
I know. Okay. Get ready. Okay, it's not going to be too bad. Okay, we're going to start with a softball. The best thing about living in Texas.
Oh, the best thing about living in Texas, mild winters, wide open spaces, low cost of living. Yeah.
Yeah, no state income tax, right?
There you go.
Ooh, jealous of that every tax season. The most broadly overlooked financial tip.
Okay. So this one is small, but over time it's huge. The backdoor Roth. So we think about, higher and higher likelihood of taxes going up. I mean, think about what's happening right now with the stimulus package, deficits, all of that. I mean, remember, there's only really, from a macroeconomic perspective, there's only two things that could, be an outcome of this. Either it's going to be increased taxation or we're going to just print money. So, especially for my younger clients, I tell them, hey, think about this backdoor Roth. It's a great way to create some tax diversity, in your long-term planning as you inch closer towards retirement. So you're not completely at the whim of a government tax rate as you take money out of a tax-deferred plan. So I think it's a simple thing to do, but it's very overlooked.
Very good. Perfect answer. Last one, your favorite finance book.
So actually there are two. So I'm going to give you both. One is a real classic. It's The Intelligent Investor by Benjamin Graham. It can be a bit of a dry read, but it's good insights into how to invest. And I think if clients read it, it'll give them a little bit more insight and maybe help them not panic so much. The second is not really a finance book, but as an advisor who coaches clients to make really good decisions, I have to think about how to get them to move in a direction that's actually in their best interest over time. So I always tell my clients, sometimes you're negotiating with yourself, not with me, as I'm trying to get you to do something, but you just don't realize that your future self will thank your present self. So another great book, which has helped me a lot in my practice, and in many ways, most financial advisors would never even have thought of this book, but they should. It's a classic. It's Getting to Yes, Negotiating Agreement Without Giving In. It's by Roger Fisher and William Ury. So it's a really good book. I have that book. I've had it for years, and every so often I go and read through it, and it helps me a lot.
So I have said before that persuasion is sort of the skill, the mother of all skills for financial professionals, because if you're trying to make a sale, what is that but trying to persuade someone to part with their money in exchange for you managing their money. If you're trying to manage behavior, what is that but persuading someone to do something difficult and stay the course when every fiber of their being is screaming for them to sell. If you're trying to be a leader in your organization, what is leadership but persuading people to work in service of a common goal? So I'm absolutely on point with you there that books on persuasion and getting to yes are at the very heart of good financial advice giving. So thank you so much, sir. You have been an invaluable resource today. I have learned a ton, and I know the listeners will as well. Thank you so much for your time.
Oh, you're very welcome. I really enjoyed it. Thank you so much.
All right.
All opinions expressed by Dr. Daniel Crosby and podcast guests are solely their own opinions and do not reflect the opinion of or endorsement by the Guardian Life Insurance Company of America, Guardian, and its affiliates, subsidiaries, employees, and agents, including Park Avenue Securities and the Guardian Network. This podcast is for informational purposes only and should not be relied upon as a basis for legal, tax, and investment decisions. The opinions are based upon information participants consider reliable, and Dr. Crosby and Guardian are not responsible for the consequences of any decisions or actions taken because of the information provided. Guardian copyright is a registered trademark of the Guardian Life Insurance Company of America. All materials are subject to United States copyright laws. Copyright 2020 Guardian. Ashvin Chheda is a registered representative and financial advisor of Park Avenue Securities, LLC, PAS. Securities products and advisory services offered through PAS, member FINRA, SIPC. Financial representative of the Guardian Life Insurance Company of America, copyright Guardian. New York, New York. PAS is a wholly owned subsidiary of Guardian. OPES One Advisors is not an affiliate or subsidiary of PAS or Guardian. Guest speakers and their firms are not affiliated with or endorsed by PAS, Guardian, or OPES One Advisors, and opinions stated are their own. OPES One Advisors is not registered in any state or with the U.S. Securities and Exchange Commission as a registered investment advisor. AR Insurance License Number 8068544, CA Insurance License Number 0H09883, 2020-98571, expiration 04-22.